So Martin, we've had rather an adventure through world literature in this whole series that we've been doing. And I was thinking as we come to the end now, it might be nice to go back to our own origins. What brought you into this interest in world literature?
Yeah, I think I was sort of aware of world literature, at least that there were all these different languages and literatures out there very early. Growing up in Europe, in southern Germany, you drive 2 hours in one direction, different language, different culture, 2 hours in another direction, same thing. I studied foreign languages relatively early, starting in primary school, French and English and a little later Latin, and you get exposed to the language and literature. So in that sense, I think I never had a really sort of a national phase of literature. It was sort of comparative literature, world literature. To some extent, from the beginning, though, in a European context. And I think the real exposure to the incredible worldwide riches of literature happened much later, when I was in my 30s and when I was asked to edit one of these big world literature anthologies, which you also have edited. And that really blew open a whole nother world where I was forced to or allowed to read or supposed to read all these literatures that I had not read before. So there's one moment very early and then one much later. And those two, I think, contributed to my formation. Now, you also edited one of these anthologies, but this was probably also not the first, but one of many different exposures to world
I think
literature.
for me, partly it goes back to family origin. So I grew up in the United States, very much U.S. Anglo background, but my parents had met in the Philippines, where my father was a missionary, an Anglican missionary in the World War II era. I always grew up hearing about this kind of charmed early period of their lives, and also descended on my father's side from European immigrants, German Jews. I always had a sense of some other kind of culture. But actually it was probably even English literature that made me into a comparatist. In ninth grade, my ninth grade English teacher gave me a wonderful book, Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, great 18th century novelist. And I totally fell in love with this. I'd been reading before then obsessively Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, which itself is actually a work of world literature, absolutely.
And I'm a big, that's something we share.
Absolutely, exactly. It's a revelation of other worlds, in fact. And a world that kind of maps oddly, uncannily onto the European world. All of the tensions of World War I and World War II are inscribed there. So that's already one work of English literature that's inventing another world. Then Lawrence Sterne is inventing his own 18th century English world. And from that background, I might well have just continued only with English literature, except that Sterne speaks of Sterne's hero, Tristram Shandy, it's his life and opinions. He speaks of his favorite writers among his opinions. And he speaks not of, say, Defoe and Chaucer, but of my dear Rabelais and my dear Cervantes. And I thought at age 16, well, I don't know who those guys are, but if he likes them, I would like them. So I started reading.
So you went out to read them because they were mentioned.
I mentioned, exactly. And this to me is actually one of the ways to pursue world literature, is to see who your favorite writers are. So for that, I read, at age 15, 16, Gargantua, Pantagruel, and Don Quixote. I then think, I really love these satiric, rollicking works. I want something more like that. In the back of my Penguin Classics edition, they have other classics mentioned. I see this book by someone called Dante called The Divine Comedy. I think, that'll be another thigh slapper. Let me try reading that. I soon discover it wasn't quite, the laugh riot I'd been expecting. But from this, I'm suddenly in the world of world literature.
That's a great story.
And I think still to this day, Cervantes is a real sort of touchstone for me for world literature. My advice perhaps for our participants, if they had to go further, there are several options, one of which is read more and whoever you liked the best. Read who they liked the best.
The way you did
which
with
worked for me very well. And then also, I think, see who's keeps coming back to other people. Cervantes, it was so important for a number of figures. And I think also partly because he is really writing a work of world literature. His hero Quixote, sets out on a quest. He's not happy with the life he's leading, the constrained life of impoverished minor noblemen. He goes out into Spain. It's very much about the world, but it's also a voyage out into world literature itself, into the world of knightly romances and all the real stresses of his own world. There's a wonderful moment about 20 chapters in where he describes what a knight-errant has to do. And this is his model. He says, a knight-errant must wander through the world in quest of adventures. It goes on for several pages very eloquently, describing all the things you'll find. At the end, he says, it transpires that the knight is the son of a valiant king. Of what kingdom I do not know, for I do not think it is on the map. And it seems to me that world literature really offers us a sense that the world does not have to be this way. There are other maps that we can make.
Yeah. It's interesting, there is this through line of maps and geography. And we have been emphasizing to some extent where writers emerged, what the countries and empires and changing fortunes of these different parts of the world have been and how they've influenced these works of literature. But it's true that at the same time, worlds of literatures have their own maps and construct their own worlds.
Exactly. I've also been particularly interested by our own explorations together. I think it's been so much fun working these texts through with you from these different perspectives. Particularly struck by your interest in technologies and the way that these works come into the world in a very material way. Whether it is the cuneiform tablets, whether it is the evolution of the Greek alphabet that makes it possible for the Homeric poets to write the way they do, and on, I suppose, to today's internet age. I really gained a lot from thinking through your eyes about the sort of worldliness of texts as material objects.
I think since we are living through a kind of revolution in writing technologies, it makes sense that we today would have a sharper eye for these earlier moments and notice how the invention of print, of course, but also the invention of paper or papyrus or the invention of print in China would have such a revolutionary impact as well.
And what do you think today? Our sequence pretty much goes up to the dawn of the 20th century, but that's now some while back. Where do you see world literature going today?
It's interesting. I mean, if we think of it in terms, if we say that different phases of world literature have been to some extent driven by technological change, it stands to reason that it will change because the way we read and write, the way literature is produced and consumed and distributed is changing. But I think it's too early to see. I mean, the real impact of print took probably hundreds of years to make itself felt. And so we may not live to see the real effect of our writing revolution. In terms of where literature is going, I think one thing that I notice is I think there's something interesting happening with genre literature. Even some of the authors we've read, Borges comes to mind, who was so interested in detective fiction. There's this sense that even through the 20th century, genre literature, these lower genres like detective fiction or thrillers or science fiction, or since you just mentioned Lord of the Rings, fantasy fiction, right? These are genre fiction. For most of the 20th century, the writers who won Nobel Prizes, who gained the most literary prestige, who made it into world literature, were sometimes in dialogue with genre fiction, but they didn't write genre fiction. If you wanted to be a famous literary author, you had to aim for more than just genre fiction. This is how it was always talked about. I think just in the last 10, 15 years, there's something happening where more and more writers are trying to write in certain forms of genre fiction or reinventing genre fiction. I just read the new novel by Ishiguro, which is an attempt at a fantasy that's sort of set in the medieval world. Sort of in Lord of the Rings world, perhaps. So I think there's something happening around high literature and genre fiction.
And we had a writer like Ursula Le Guin.
Ursula Le Guin.
You know, extremely good writer and writing a fantasy fiction, you know, really serious work.
And she's also, in terms of genre, an interesting figure because she has combined in some of her fiction what's in genre terms called fantasy and science fiction, and there are relatively few writers who actually have done that.
Exactly. Right now I'm just working with a couple of European colleagues on a collection of essays on crime fiction as world literature, in fact. And one of the things that's very interesting is how totally global this genre is. Writers in Thailand are reading Swedish crime fiction, writers who are reading American ones. It's all quite post-national,
right.
and yet it's all very, very local. It's not even a national tradition so much as there might be a Stockholm tradition and a Bangkok tradition and a LA noir kind of tradition. Very interesting process. And also that in a number of cases, you had peripheral writers translating detective fiction into their language in order to stimulate more literary writing in their language. Hebrew and Catalan are two examples of this. Very interesting. Yeah. So there's a real interplay between the popular and the high literature that I think is one of the most interesting things about world literature today.
Now, one thing that you have emphasized, and I learned a lot from you, there is the importance of circulation of literature. That on the one hand, we can look at literature in terms of the place where it was produced, the culture that produced it, the first readers for whom it was written, and that's an important aspect, and we've emphasized it to some extent. But that in a world literature course especially, what's at least as important is what happens when it travels outside its original context, how it gets translated, how it gets reinterpreted, understood by different readers. So that seems to be another through line, I think, for the course.
Yes. And I think both in terms of the course itself and how people might go further, it's partly a matter of looking at these worldwide webs of connection. And also in selected cases where someone is really turned on by a particular writer, then you want to delve in. You want to see them, who are they when they're at home, as Molly Bloom says of the term metempsychosis. You know, how is it transformed back into its home culture? Who else is there? If there's this one great author, so if you really like Cervantes, who else, must there be who's that good? Because you rarely get the isolated, Alp by itself without a whole range around it.
And this seems to me something that happens again and again when you think or read around world literature, that it's not just global. It's not that everything is global. There is this real important interplay between very local contexts and global circulation.
And I think also the issue of language is very, very interesting here, the issues of translation. We are certainly fans of reading in translation, but I also have the utopian hope that unpredictably anyone may be inspired to learn a new language, to study something. I've more than once studied a language because I fell in love with, particularly often, poetry in translation. I thought, well, at some point I want to get closer to it. And even, a chance encounter can have remarkable effects. My middle kid changed schools to go from grammar school to a high school where she could study Japanese. We did it for 4 years, 2 summers in Japan, studying it in college because in 3rd grade her class went to a tea ceremony. And it seems to me a world literature class opens up the world in so many ways.
It does.
Unpredictable. You don't know what will strike whom, but I think that's also been very important. It's localized and it leads us deeply in as well as broadly around the world. And I think, to me, a perfect image of this, maybe my sort of concluding thought would be from one of my favorite world authors, Italo Calvino. I think I want to come back to this question also, why read earlier stuff? So much of contemporary literature catches our attention, and one feature of world literature studies is that often you're looking at a good deal of earlier material. And I think one thing we've seen, another through line in our course, I think, is how contemporary these older works often are. The works that still survive and come to us as world literature speak to us today very strongly. With Calvino, very interesting, his book Invisible Cities from 1970 is looking back at, you could say, the origins of world literature in the early modern period. Marco Polo is going to court of Kublai Khan and comes back and writes a sort of adventure story about it. One of the first really global works of, you could say, travelogue. Is it literature? Is it popular? What is it? And in Calvino's retelling, Marco Polo is the ambassador and he's describing to Kublai Khan the cities of his realm, which is too big for the Khan himself to see, these invisible cities. And they're kind of unreal cities. And about halfway through the book, the Khan says, these cities don't really exist. It's a city suspended from a net, and it's a city that has the underworld as its mirror. And what about your own city, Venice? And Polo says, well, have I been talking about anything else? And there's a wonderful moment towards the end where he tells the Kublai Khan, the empire is sick, and what is worse is trying to become accustomed to its sores. This is the aim of my explorations, examining the traces of happiness still to be glimpsed. I gauge its short supply. At times, all I need is a brief glimpse, an opening in the midst of an incongruous landscape, a glint of light in the fog, a dialogue of 2 passers-by meeting in the crowd. And I think that setting out from there, I will put together, piece by piece, the perfect city, made of fragments mixed with the rest. And I think our dialogue is, in some sense, our version of this perfect city of world literature.